On the morning of September 15th, 1852, a local trapper named Elias Thorne was checking his lines along the muddy eastern banks of the Unearth River, just outside the small settlement of Cypress Bend, Louisiana. The air was thick with the late summer humidity that hangs over the region like a wet blanket. What caught his eye, and what would later become the first piece of evidence in the Blackwood broussard case, was an abandoned carriage, its wheel half sunk in the soft riverbank mud. Inside the carriage, Thorne found nothing but a single silk glove, a man's leather-bound ledger with no entries, and strangely, a silver locket containing no photograph. The carriage bore the crest of the Blackwood plantation, one of the larger estates some 5 miles east of the town. By noon that day, when Thorne reported his discovery to the Cypress Bend constable, it was noted that no one from the Blackwood household had been to town in nearly 3 weeks. It wasn't unusual for plantation owners to remain on their property for extended periods, especially during the sugar harvest. However, Alistair Blackwood was known for his meticulous routine. He made weekly visits to the Merchants' Bank of Cypress Bend every Thursday without fail. According to bank records later accessed during the investigation, Blackwood had missed 3 consecutive appointments without sending word. The constable, a man named James Finch, dispatched 2 deputies to the Blackwood plantation that afternoon. What they found there would become the foundation of one of the most disturbing documented cases in the history of St. Helena Parish, a case that, for reasons that will soon become apparent, was deliberately kept from official records for nearly 70 years. According to the deputy's initial report, the main house appeared to be in perfect order. The 27 enslaved people who worked the sugarcane fields continued their labor as if nothing were amiss. The house servants maintained their duties. Meals had been prepared and served at the usual times. Beds had been made. It was as if the Blackwood family was simply elsewhere on the property. But they weren't. Alistair Blackwood, age 48, his wife Eleanor, age 44, and their 3 adult children, Thomas, 24, Caroline, 21, and William, 19, were nowhere to be found. The only person in the household who seemed out of place was Genevieve Broussard, a house slave of approximately 30 years of age. According to the other servants, she had taken to sitting motionless in the parlor when not attending to her duties. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of the room. When questioned by the deputies, none of the enslaved people reported anything unusual. Each one provided the exact same response, delivered in an unnervingly calm and rehearsed tone. Master Blackwood has gone to visit his cousin in Natchez. He is expected back before the harvest. Alistair Blackwood had no cousin in Natchez. According to all available records, he had no cousins at all. Over the following weeks, a quiet investigation was conducted. The neighboring plantation owners were consulted. The Blackwood family's absence was acknowledged, but curiously, none expressed any real concern. Like the enslaved people on the property, they all seemed to accept without question that the family had simply gone away. When pressed for more details, they became uncomfortable and changed the subject. Parish records from October 1852 indicate that a more formal, though still very private, investigation was initiated by Judge Martin Dubois, who had been a business associate of Alistair Blackwood. It was Dubois who first noted what he called the strange silence that seemed to hang over the entire case. "It is not merely that the family has disappeared," he wrote in his private journal, which was discovered decades later. "It is that no one seems to want to speak of it. It is as if the community has collectively agreed to look away from something they cannot bear to see." By November of 1852, with the Blackwood family still missing, the plantation continued to operate as if nothing were wrong. The harvest proceeded on schedule. Sugarcane was collected, processed, and shipped to market. Profits were deposited into the Blackwood account at the Merchants' Bank. According to bank records, the deposits were authorized by a signature that matched Alistair Blackwood's. though the man himself was never seen. It was during this period that the first reports began to emerge regarding Genevieve Broussard's behavior. The house slave, who had previously been noted for sitting motionless in the parlor, was now observed by other servants to be occupying the master bedroom. According to hushed accounts that were later documented by Judge Dubois, she had taken to wearing Eleanor Blackwood's clothes and jewelry. More disturbing were the reports that Genevieve had begun to speak as if she were Mrs. Blackwood, giving orders in a perfect imitation of the missing woman's voice and mannerisms. The other house servants, apparently terrified, complied without question. In his private notes, Judge Dubois described interviewing a field hand named Isaac, who had been caught attempting to flee the plantation in early December. Before being returned to Blackwood, Isaac allegedly told the judge, "There ain't no Blackwoods no more." Miss Genevieve, she says there never was. The judge noted that after Isaac was returned to the plantation, the man was never seen again. His disappearance was explained away as a successful escape attempt, despite the doubled patrols that had been established following his first attempt. By January of 1853, a strange and unsettling pattern had emerged. The Blackwood plantation continued to function. Business transactions occurred, sugar was sold, supplies were purchased, yet the family remained absent. More troubling were the reports from the few tradespeople and merchants who visited the property. They described being greeted by Genevieve Broussard, who now openly presented herself as Mrs. Blackwood. According to one account by a seamstress who had come to deliver dresses ordered months earlier by Eleanor, "The Negro woman received me in the parlor, dressed in Mrs. Blackwood's clothing. She spoke with perfect diction and addressed me as if we had met many times before. When I inquired after Mrs. Blackwood, the woman looked at me strangely and said, 'I am Mrs. Blackwood.' What disturbed me most was not her claim, but how naturally she seemed to inhabit the role." Judge Dubois, increasingly troubled, attempted to organize a more thorough investigation in February 1853. His efforts were blocked at every turn. Local officials were reluctant to interfere with what they called private plantation matters. Fellow judges advised him to let the matter rest. It was during this period that Dubois began to document what he described as a conspiracy of silence. In a letter to his brother in New Orleans, discovered after the judge's death, he wrote, "Something has happened here that no one wishes to acknowledge. It is as if speaking of it might make it real, so they choose instead to look away and pretend." The most disturbing development came in March 1853, when a daguerreotype was taken at the Blackwood plantation during a gathering of neighboring plantation owners. The image, which surfaced in a private collection in 1931, shows what appears to be a formal dinner party. Seated at the head of the table is not Alistair Blackwood, but Genevieve Broussard, dressed in fine clothes. More unsettling is the fact that none of the white guests seated around her seemed to find anything unusual about the arrangement. According to an analysis of the image conducted by Dr. Harold Bennett of Tulane University in 1934, the expressions on the faces of the dinner guests show no discomfort or awareness that anything is amiss. They are engaged in conversation, smiling, raising glasses. The African-American woman in Eleanor Blackwood's clothing is being treated as if she were, indeed, the lady of the house. By April 1853, Judge Dubois' inquiries had attracted unwanted attention. He reported receiving anonymous threats. His house was vandalized. In May, he was removed from the bench on charges of mental instability. Shortly thereafter, he relocated to New Orleans, taking with him his private records of the Blackwood investigation. The most comprehensive account of what may have happened comes from an unexpected source. In 1866, after the Civil War, a former slave from the neighboring Landry plantation named Joseph Cooper provided testimony to a Union Army officer. Cooper's account, preserved in military archives until 1948, describes events that occurred on the night of August 25, 1852, 3 weeks before the abandoned carriage was found. According to Cooper, who claimed to have been secretly visiting the Blackwood plantation that night, the trouble had been building for years. Master Blackwood, he said, he had a particular cruelty about him, not the kind that leaves marks you can see, but the kind that breaks something inside. And Miss Genevieve, she suffered more than most. Cooper described Genevieve Broussard as having been purchased by Alistair Blackwood in 1845. She had previously been owned by a French family in New Orleans, was educated and spoke both English and French fluently. Blackwood, according to Cooper's account, had purchased her specifically to serve as his wife's personal maid, but had other intentions. What Master Blackwood did to Miss Genevieve over those years, it changed her, Cooper stated. Not all at once, but slowly, like water dripping on stone. There was a day when something in her eyes just wasn't there anymore. The night of August 25th began, according to Cooper, with an elaborate dinner prepared by Genevieve. The entire Blackwood family was present. By Cooper's account, nothing seemed unusual until after the meal, when the family began to show signs of distress. They was grabbing at their throats, their eyes bulging. Master Blackwood, he looked straight at Miss Genevieve like he finally understood something. And Miss Genevieve, she just sat there, watching them all, calm as still water. Cooper's testimony suggests that Genevieve Broussard poisoned the entire Blackwood family that evening. What happened next, however, is what transforms the story from a simple act of revenge into something nearly incomprehensible. Miss Genevieve, Cooper said, she gathered all the house slaves in the kitchen. She told them, "The Blackwoods have gone to visit family in Natchez. I will be managing the household in their absence." And then, this is the part I still can't make sense of, everyone just nodded. Like this was perfectly normal. Like they hadn't just seen what I'd seen. Cooper described how Genevieve methodically organized the disposal of the bodies, directing several trusted field hands to bury the Blackwood family in the swampland at the far eastern edge of the property, an area rarely visited. After that night, Cooper continued, it was like the Blackwoods had never existed. Miss Genevieve, she started wearing Mrs. Blackwood's clothes, sleeping in their bed. At first just around the slaves, but then when visitors would come, she'd receive them just like she was the lady of the house. The most disturbing element of Cooper's testimony was his description of how the neighboring plantation owners and the Society of Cypress Bend responded. The white folks, they'd come to dinner, sit at her table, talk with her like she was one of them. It wasn't that they were fooled. They knew who she was. It was like they chose not to see what was happening. Like it was easier to pretend. Cooper's account suggests a collective delusion, or perhaps a collective agreement, that allowed the white society of the parish to interact with Genevieve Broussard as if she were Eleanor Blackwood, rather than confront the horrifying alternative, that an enslaved woman had murdered her owners and taken their place. Judge Dubois, in his final known writing on the subject, perhaps best articulated the psychology at work. They cannot acknowledge what has happened without acknowledging what preceded it, and that, it seems, is the one thing they cannot bear to face. The historical record after 1853 becomes a collection of whispers and shadows, a story told in the gaps between official documents. The Blackwood plantation continued to operate, apparently under Genevieve Broussard's management, though all official papers bore Alistair Blackwood's forged signature. Business associates who had known the real Alistair for years conducted transactions through Genevieve, referring to her in their correspondence with carefully chosen ambiguous phrases like, "the representative of the Blackwood interests." In 1855, a fire destroyed most of the main house at the Blackwood plantation. No deaths were reported. The property was rebuilt on a more modest scale, and operations continued. When the Civil War began in 1861, it disrupted sugar production throughout the South. Records from this period are scarce, but tax documents show that the Blackwood plantation remained active, though at a reduced capacity, following the Union victory and the emancipation of enslaved people. The Blackwood property, like so many others, faced an uncertain future. What makes this case unique is that there was no white owner to either abandon the property or attempt to transition to a new labor model. According to local land records, in 1866, the Blackwood plantation was formally transferred to a Mrs. Adelaide LeBlanc, described in the documents as a free woman of color. The transaction was processed by the same bank that had handled the Blackwood accounts for decades. There is no further mention of Genevieve Broussard in any official capacity after this point. Adelaide LeBlanc appears in census records from 1870 as the owner of a modest but productive farm on what had once been Blackwood land. She is described as a widow, with no children. This legal transformation from an enslaved woman to a property owner is one of the most remarkable and mysterious aspects of the entire case. It could not have happened without the active or at least willfully blind complicity of bankers, lawyers, and parish officials. The most unsettling postscript to this story comes from a series of interviews conducted in 1929 by a folklorist named Margaret Dunn, who was collecting oral histories in Louisiana. Dunn interviewed several elderly residents of St. Helena Parish, including a 94-year-old woman named Josephine Taylor, who claimed to have been a house slave on a neighboring plantation during the time of the Blackwood incident. Taylor's account largely supported Joseph Cooper's testimony, but added one significant and chilling detail. According to her, the conspiracy of silence surrounding the events at the Blackwood plantation was not just about fear or denial. It wasn't just that they pretended not to see, Taylor told Dunn. Some of them, the wives especially, they understood. They'd sit with her, take tea with her, discuss household matters, all the while knowing exactly who she was and what she'd done. And in their eyes, there was something like admiration. When asked to elaborate, Taylor reportedly said there were other wives who wished they could do what she did. Not just to be free, but to make the ones who hurt them pay. They lived through her. That's why they protected her. That's why they saw her as Mrs. Blackwood. Because in another world, maybe they could have done what she did. The final documented reference to the case appears in a private letter written in 1936 by Edward Dubois, grandson of Judge Martin Dubois, to a colleague at Louisiana State University. In it, he declines a request to publish his grandfather's notes. "Some stories once told cannot be untold," he wrote. "My grandfather spent the remainder of his life haunted not by what happened at the Blackwood plantation, but by what it revealed about the society in which he lived. Some truths are too terrible to acknowledge, and so we construct elaborate fictions to avoid them. The Blackwood case is not just a story about one family and one woman, but about an entire society's capacity for self-deception." Adelaide LeBlanc died in 1882. Parish records state she was buried in a small cemetery on what had once been the eastern edge of the Blackwood plantation. Her grave marker, documented in a 1954 survey of historical sites, bore only a name and 2 dates. In 1962, during the construction of what would later become Interstate 12, workers excavating in the swampland that had once been part of the Blackwood property discovered human remains. According to the brief police report, 5 skeletons were recovered: 2 adult males, 1 adult female, and 2 individuals of indeterminate gender. The remains were estimated to have been buried for over a century. No further investigation was conducted. The remains were eventually reinterred in an unmarked section of a local cemetery. The land that once made up the Blackwood plantation has since been subdivided, developed, and incorporated into the expanding suburbs of Baton Rouge. Nothing remains of the original structures, No historical markers commemorate the events that took place there. If not for the scattered documents, private journals, and oral histories that survived, the story of Alistair Blackwood and Genevieve Broussard might have disappeared entirely, one more silence in a history filled with them. What makes this case so profoundly disturbing is not just the act of murder itself, but how an entire community could collectively agree to accept an impossible fiction rather than confront an unbearable truth. It reminds us that sometimes the most terrifying aspect of human nature is not what we do, but what we choose not to see. Today, if you drive along Interstate 12 just east of Baton Rouge, you pass directly over the ground where the Blackwood family was likely buried. Thousands of people traverse this route daily, unaware of what lies beneath. Like the society that once chose not to see Genevieve Broussard sitting in Eleanor Blackwood's place, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface like bodies in shallow graves after a heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural but entirely human. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this: how many other Genevieve Broussards have been erased from our history? How many other unbearable truths have we as a society collectively agreed not to see? The final entry in Judge Dubois' journal, dated January 18, 1854, just months before his death, reads simply, "What frightens me most is not that such things can happen. It is that we can look directly at them and see nothing at all." In 1965, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana, attempted to publish a comprehensive study of the Blackwood case. Her research, drawing on many of the same sources cited here, was met with resistance from both academic institutions and local historical societies. Her manuscript was rejected by 14 publishers before being indefinitely shelved. The reason given was not a lack of evidence, but a concern that the story was too unsettling and subversive. The case represented not just a failure of the slave system, but a complete inversion of it, tacitly accepted by the very society it undermined. Perhaps most revealing was the response Pritchard received from the St. Helena Parish Historical Society. When she requested access to any records they might have, the director replied with a brief note stating, "No such family is recorded in our archives." This deliberate erasure extended beyond mere historical oversight. As recently as 1958, when the foundations of what was likely the original Blackwood plantation house were uncovered during construction, local newspapers reported the discovery as colonial-era ruins of unknown origin. The truth, it seemed, was determined to resurface. In 1966, renovations to the old Merchants Bank building in Cypress Bend uncovered a hidden compartment in what had once been the bank manager's office. Inside was a leather portfolio containing transaction records from 1852 to 1855. These documents, now held in the Louisiana State Archives, include ledger entries for the Blackwood account signed in two distinctly different hands, both claiming to be Alistair Blackwood. Graphologists later confirmed that the earlier signatures matched known examples of Alistair's handwriting, while the later ones were skillful imitations. More telling are the subtle changes in the account's management after August 1852. Prior to that date, withdrawals were primarily for business expenses. After that date, new patterns emerged: smaller, regular withdrawals of cash, and the purchase of several medical texts and French-language books from a New Orleans bookstore. In 1853, the account shows payment to a tutor from New Orleans described as providing educational services on the plantation twice weekly. This same year, there are records of payments to a dressmaker, a jeweler, and an importer of fine goods from France. expenses more consistent with the establishment of a new identity than the maintenance of an existing one. The bank records also reveal that in 1854, the Blackwood account funded the purchase of freedom papers for 3 individuals described only as former property of neighboring estates. This remarkable transaction, a slave owner using plantation profits to free other planters' slaves, went apparently unremarked upon by bank officials. Perhaps most significant is a notation from November 1854 regarding the establishment of a separate account in the name of Adelaide LeBlanc, with an initial deposit transferred from the Blackwood holdings. This marks the beginning of the financial transition that would eventually lead to the formal transfer of the property in 1866. These financial records paint a picture not of a sudden, violent rupture, but of a methodical, patient reconstruction of identity, one that required the complicity, or at least the willful blindness, of numerous officials, merchants, and community members over a period of years. The question that has haunted researchers for decades is, how was this possible? How could an enslaved woman not only murder her owners but assume the social position of the plantation mistress, however imperfectly, without facing immediate discovery and punishment? Dr. Marcus Thorne, in his 1953 analysis of antebellum power structures, suggested that the very rigidity of the slave society paradoxically created the conditions for its subversion. The system was so predicated on absolute racial categories that when confronted with a situation that defied those categories, many simply could not process what they were seeing. It was easier to participate in a collective fiction than to acknowledge a reality that threatened the entire foundation of their world. This theory is supported by fragmentary accounts from the period. A letter from Eliza Landry, wife of a neighboring plantation owner, to her sister in Virginia, dated October 1853, makes an oblique reference to the unusual situation at the Blackwood estate, noting that we have all found it more convenient to accept what we are presented with than to inquire too deeply into matters better left undisturbed. The collective silence extended beyond the white community. Joseph Cooper's testimony suggests that the enslaved people on the Blackwood plantation, with few exceptions, also participated in maintaining the fiction that nothing had changed. This complicity may have stemmed from fear, but Cooper's account hints at something more complex, a shared understanding that to acknowledge Genevieve's actions would bring swift and terrible retribution, not just to her, but to all of them. "We all knew," Cooper told the Union officer. "Every slave on that plantation knew, but to speak it would be to destroy it. And some of us, we wanted to see how far it could go, how long the white folks would choose not to see what was right before them." The daguerreotype from March 1853 remains perhaps the most disturbing artifact of the case. The image, subjected to modern analysis in 1969, confirms that the woman seated at the head of the table is indeed of African descent, though dressed in the finest European fashion of the period. More remarkable are the expressions on the faces of the white dinner guests, not disgust or fear, but what appears to be genuine social engagement. Dr. Catherine Monroe, a psychologist who studied the case in the 1970s, suggested that the dinner guests may have been experiencing a phenomenon she termed selective reality, a form of collective dissociation where a group agrees, without explicitly stating so, to perceive a situation in a way that preserves their understanding of how the world should function. Rather than see a former slave who had murdered her owners and usurped their position, a reality too threatening to their entire worldview, they saw what their minds could accept, a somewhat unusual but still recognizable social scenario where they were dining with the representative of the Blackwood family. "The human mind," Monroe wrote, "is remarkably adept at reframing reality when the alternative is too psychologically damaging to contemplate." This theory is given credence by accounts from the period that describe interactions with Adelaide LeBlanc in curiously ambiguous terms. A business associate of the Blackwood plantation wrote in 1854 of meeting with the lady of the house, who speaks for Blackwood interests with remarkable clarity and understanding for one of her station. The deliberate ambiguity of her station reveals both awareness and denial. What emerges from these fragments is the portrait of a community engaged in an elaborate performance, one where everyone knew their lines but never acknowledged the script. Plantation owners, merchants, bankers, and the enslaved all participated in maintaining a fiction that allowed them to navigate a situation that, if acknowledged directly, would have required a violent resolution. The story of what happened in the years after the Civil War offers its own disturbing insights. Adelaide LeBlanc's transition from representing the Blackwood interest to legally owning the property herself coincides with the broader social upheaval of Reconstruction. In this period of tremendous change and uncertainty, the fiction that had been maintained for nearly 2 decades could finally be partially resolved, not through an acknowledgement of the truth, but through its transformation into a new, more acceptable narrative. Adelaide LeBlanc appears in the 1870 census as a widow and property owner of mixed race. Her neighbors, according to tax records, included former plantation owners now farming smaller parcels of their once vast holdings. The fiction had evolved. No longer the white plantation mistress, she became instead a free woman of color who had somehow acquired property. Unusual but not impossible in the Reconstruction era. Church records from St. Joseph's Catholic Church in Cypress Bend list Adelaide LeBlanc as a congregant and contributor from 1867 until her death. The same church records make no mention of Genevieve Broussard, nor of the Blackwood family, despite their prominence in the community for decades before their disappearance. The most poignant artifact from Adelaide LeBlanc's later years is a daguerreotype taken around 1875. Discovered in 1948 in the possession of a family descended from formerly enslaved people on the neighboring Landry plantation. It shows an elderly woman of African descent, dressed plainly but with dignity, seated in a chair on the porch of a modest farmhouse. According to notes accompanying the image, the woman was known locally as Madame LeBlanc and was respected for her knowledge of herbal medicine and her willingness to treat both black and white residents of the area. The notes make no mention of her past, stating only that she came into her property after the war and was known to help former slaves establish themselves with small loans and gifts of seed and livestock. If this image indeed depicts Genevieve Broussard in her final incarnation as Adelaide LeBlanc, it suggests that she managed not only to survive, but to establish a new identity that allowed her to live openly, if not entirely honestly, until her death. The transformation from enslaved woman to plantation mistress to respected landowner represents an extraordinary navigation of the treacherous racial and social hierarchies of 19th century Louisiana. Adelaide LeBlanc died on September 12, 1882. According to parish records, the cause of death is listed as complications of age. Her will, a remarkably detailed document for someone who had once been property rather than a property owner, distributed her modest estate among several families in the area, many of whom were formerly enslaved. The will makes no reference to her life before emancipation. The small cemetery where Adelaide LeBlanc was buried was relocated in 1959 to make way for highway construction. Her remains, along with others from the cemetery, were moved to a larger cemetery in Baton Rouge. According to cemetery records, her grave marker, a simple stone bearing the inscription Adelaide LeBlanc, 1822 to 1882 at rest, was not among those successfully relocated. Today, her final resting place is unmarked. In the decades since, the Blackwood Broussard case has remained a footnote in Louisiana history, referenced occasionally in academic texts but rarely examined in detail. The reasons for this continued obscurity are not difficult to discern. The case presents uncomfortable truths about power, race, and collective delusion that remain relevant today. Dr. Eleanor Pritchard, whose attempt to publish a comprehensive study in the 1960s was unsuccessful, wrote in her personal journal, "The Blackwood case is not merely a historical curiosity. It's a mirror in which we might see our own capacity for self-deception, our own willingness to embrace comfortable fictions rather than confront disturbing truths." This observation gains particular resonance when we consider how the physical evidence of the case has been systematically erased from the landscape. The Blackwood plantation house, burned and rebuilt, was eventually demolished. The land was subdivided and developed. The graves were paved over. The documents were hidden away or destroyed. Even the final resting place of the woman at the center of the story was lost to time. Yet the story persists, passed down through fragments of documents, oral histories, and the occasional academic study. It survives because, despite all efforts to erase it, it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and social structures. In 1964, during an interview conducted as part of the Federal Writers Project, a 101-year-old woman named Clara Johnson, who had been born into slavery in St. Helena Parish, was asked if she remembered anything about the Blackwood plantation. After a long silence, she replied, "Some stories ain't meant to be told straight out. Some stories get told in the spaces between words, in the things people don't say. That Blackwood place. Folks knew what happened there. They just found it easier to look away, and sometimes looking away is its own kind of seeing." Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Blackwood broussard case is not the initial violence, the poisoning of a family by an enslaved woman pushed beyond endurance. It is the response to that violence, a community's decision to participate in a fiction rather than confront a reality that threatened their understanding of the world. This collective self-deception, this agreement to see what could not exist rather than acknowledge what did, reveals how fragile our social constructs can be, and how desperately we will work to maintain them, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. In 1968, a final piece of the puzzle emerged when a collection of letters was discovered during renovations to an old home in the Garden District of New Orleans. The letters, written between 1852 and 1855, were from Eleanor Blackwood's sister, Caroline Beaumont, to her husband, who was serving as a diplomat in France. In these letters, Caroline makes several references to her concerns about her sister's family. In October 1852, she writes, "I have received no word from Eleanor since my letter of July. I have written twice more and dispatched a messenger to the plantation, but have been informed that the family is traveling. I find this most unlike my sister, who has never been fond of leaving home." By December, her concern had grown into alarm. "I attempted to call at the plantation myself, but was received by Eleanor's maid, Genevieve, who insisted that the family remained away on business. There was something in her manner that disturbed me greatly, though I cannot say precisely what. She spoke as Eleanor might, used expressions familiar to my sister. When I pressed her on when the family might return, she smiled in a way that chilled me and said, 'They are never coming back, but we need not speak of that.'" Most revealing is Caroline's letter from January 1853. "I have shared my concerns with Judge Dubois, who agrees that something is terribly wrong. Yet when we attempt to raise the alarm, we are met with indifference or hostility. It is as if no one wishes to acknowledge that anything is amiss." Even more disturbing, I called upon the Landrys, who claimed to have dined with my sister just the week before. When I insisted that this could not be true, Mrs. Landry became quite cold and suggested that perhaps I was unwell. Caroline's final letter on the matter, dated March 1853, reveals her growing isolation and self-doubt. "I find myself increasingly unwelcome in Cypress Bend society. My questions about Eleanor and her family are met with silence or outright hostility. Even Judge Dubois now suggests that I should let the matter rest. I am beginning to question my own mind. Is it possible that I am indeed unwell? That I have imagined a mystery where none exists? And yet, I know my sister. I know she would never leave without a word to me. Something terrible has happened at that plantation, but it seems I am alone in my certainty. Shortly after this letter, Caroline Beaumont returned to France to join her husband. There is no record of her ever returning to Louisiana. The Blackwood case, it seems, claimed not only the lives of the family but also the peace of mind of those who could not accept the collective fiction. In 24 additional letters discovered in the same collection, Caroline never again mentions her sister or the Blackwood family. It is as if, unable to resolve the contradiction between what she knew and what society insisted was true, she chose to excise the matter entirely from her correspondence, if not from her thoughts. This willful forgetting, this deliberate looking away extends beyond the individuals directly involved to encompass the broader historical record. The systematic erasure of the Blackwood broussard case from official histories represents another kind of violence, the violence of omission that allows comfortable narratives to prevail over uncomfortable truths. Yet, despite these efforts at erasure, the story has survived. It survives in the fragments of documents, in oral histories, in the occasional academic study brave enough to confront its implications. It survives because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the societies we construct. The story of Alistair Blackwood and Genevieve Broussard is not merely a tale of murder and deception. It is a case study in collective delusion, in the human capacity to see what we need to see rather than what is actually before us. It reminds us that reality is not merely what exists, but what we are willing to acknowledge. Perhaps most unsettling is the realization that this capacity for collective self-deception is not confined to the past. We too participate in fictions that allow us to maintain our understanding of how the world functions. We too look away from truths that threaten our sense of order. And like the society that chose not to see Genevieve Broussard sitting in Eleanor Blackwood's place, we may not recognize our own delusions until long after they have shaped our reality. The final word on the Blackwood Broussard case might belong to Judge Martin Dubois, who wrote in his journal shortly before his death, "The most terrifying aspect of this affair is not what it reveals about Genevieve Broussard or even about the institution of slavery. It is what it reveals about us all. Our willingness to embrace a lie rather than face a truth that disturbs our sense of order. I fear this tendency lies dormant in every human heart, waiting for the moment when reality becomes too painful to bear." Today, the city of Baton Rouge and its suburbs have grown around and over the land where these events took place. Modern highways, shopping centers, and subdivisions have erased all physical evidence of the Blackwood plantation. Thousands of people pass daily over ground that once witnessed an extraordinary subversion of the antebellum social order. Like the society that chose to participate in Genevieve Broussard's fiction, we move through landscapes haunted by histories we have collectively agreed to forget. But some stories refuse to remain buried. They find their way back to the surface, like bodies in shallow graves after a heavy rain. They whisper to us from old documents and faded photographs. They remind us that the most disturbing horrors are not supernatural but entirely human, and that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those we can see but those we refuse to acknowledge. The story of Genevieve Broussard, who became Adelaide Leblanc, who became Madame Leblanc, is a chilling testament to the power of a single individual to manipulate the fault lines of a deeply flawed society. It is a story of revenge, survival, and reinvention, played out on a stage of collective denial. The woman who was once property became the master of her own reality, forcing an entire community to become actors in her audacious play. And in the end, she seems to have achieved a life of quiet dignity, her past a ghost that haunted others far more than it seemed to haunt her. The silence that surrounded her was her greatest weapon and her most enduring legacy. It was a silence born of fear, of guilt, of a deep-seated desire to maintain order at any cost. It was the silence of a society that could not afford to look too closely at itself for fear of what it might see, and it is a silence that even today has not been fully broken. The story of Blackwood remains a whisper, a collection of fragments, a dark and unsettling question mark in the pages of history. A reminder that the past is never truly past, and that some ghosts can never be fully laid to rest